When I think of retro gaming, what comes to mind are the fantastic games that came out on consoles back in the day. Nintendo, Sega, they all had some amazing gaming moments. But I'll tell you, my family's computer, an old black and white Macintosh, held its own against my family's NES. Both were in constant use. I'd like to think that this applied to many people back in the day, where you had a gaming console but you also had a computer. And both were about as equally entertaining when it comes to games. Consoles versus computers. They both offered different experiences. Consoles were good with games that had simpler controls, whereas computer games could get much more involved with mouse and keyboard driven input. There were several games that did come out on computers that played much better with a joystick or gamepad, and many games on the PC did support joysticks right out of the box by using the quite common game port. The game port made it easy to use a controller with your PC games. Just plug in a compatible controller and set up the controls right in the game. There were a ton of controllers for PC. I have several here, but my personal favorite was the PC ProPad line of controllers by Interact. These ones fit my hands well and always felt solid in my opinion. Unfortunately, there was no PC ProPad for Mac. There were a few gamepads and joysticks that operated over ADB, which was Apple's keyboard and mouse input port, but the selection of controllers and joysticks were very limited, and what was available was not great in my opinion. The lack of controllers was also because very few games would even officially support joysticks, and also the market just wasn't there for Mac gaming. So developers would get creative with the mouse and keyboard, which generally were good enough for games. So for the most part, you wouldn't expect to play any games on Mac with a joystick. That was, at least until the introduction of Input Sprocket. Input Sprocket was part of a set of libraries called Game Sprockets that easily allowed the use of USB joysticks and gamepads. If the game supported Input Sprocket, it was a trivial task to set up your controller. But it didn't come out until the mid-90s, so most games never used it. So to use a controller with these older games, you'd need to use a special control panel to map the keyboard and mouse to the gamepad. I covered the Gravis Mac gamepad a long time ago, so you can check out that video if you want to see more of how that worked on Mac. But today I've got a new solution to gaming with controllers on Mac. This is the ChoiceStick, released by Kernel Productions around 1995. What this little guy does is give you the choice of which stick you want to use. Or in other words, it lets you use Atari and Sega controllers on Mac. It works with both 3 and 6 button versions of the Sega controller. It plugs into the ADB port on the back of your Mac, and it's got an ADB pass-through on it, so you'll still be able to hook up your keyboard and mouse to the computer. And on the front of the unit, it accepts Sega and Atari style controllers and joysticks. I had never heard of this product before, until one day when I was checking out some Inside Mac Games discs. If you're not familiar with Inside Mac Games, these discs had reviews, demos, shareware, and advertisements on them for Mac games. And one of the ads was a video. Rough quality, but check this out.
Introducing the ChoiceStick joystick adapter for the Macintosh. The ChoiceStick joystick adapter for the Macintosh is the only product that allows you to choose which joystick you want to use. The ChoiceStick works with a wide variety of joysticks for a variety of different video game systems, and has 2 ports for 2-player simultaneous play.
Yeah, that sounded amazing, and I knew I had to find one of those. So I set a saved search on eBay, and it wasn't until a couple of years later that one actually showed up, and I ended up losing that auction, which sucked. And my saved search dragged on for several more years until another one showed up, and I jumped on this one for about 25 bucks. They were originally $70 when they were released, so I guess that's a pretty good deal. In order to use the ChoiceStick with computer games, you'd first install the control panel and extension. I didn't get the discs with mine, but they have a copy of the original software on the Macintosh Garden. I'm using version 1.5.2 here. Inside this control panel, you have a long list of games. I counted 186 that have already been all set up and are ready to go with either 3 or 6 button Sega controllers or Atari joysticks. A lot of the more popular games are here on this list, so chances are there's a preset for the game that you want to play. All you need to do is plug everything in and start up your game. This is amazing, because the less effort you've got to put into using a controller, the better in my opinion. The software automatically detects when you start a game and sets the correct preset for that game. If you need to see how the controls are set up, you're supposed to be able to hit Control-Option-Command while you're in a game to bring up the settings. I might add though, I tried this and I was never able to bring up the settings. The software does allow for advanced configuration, supporting things like auto-repeat, key toggling, multiplexed commands, mouse gravity settings, desktop friction to avoid those sharp stops, and mouse tracking. It's a very impressive and well-designed product for its time. The only real downside to this is that it only works on System 7 or newer, which kind of sucks if you want to use this with the older black and white Macs. The Mac SE is the absolute minimum that you can use with it, as earlier machines didn't have the ADB port to connect it to. The SE can run System 7 as well, but I personally don't recommend it on a computer running the original 68,000 CPU. It's just slow, and the best games for these machines run in System 6 or earlier. So yep, probably best to use this one with a Color Mac and a late 68K or PowerPC processor. Alright, so now let's get to testing this guy out on an actual hardware. I've got a few controllers I want to try with this. Let's check it out and see how well it works. So first up, I've got a 3-button Sega gamepad here, the Sega Genesis Megafire. I would test out the Genesis compatibility with a 6-button controller, but I've only got official 3-button controllers on hand, and the 6-button one I have is awful. I don't want to use that. Anyways, the big difference between the 3 and 6 button is just that. It has 3 more buttons. Probably would benefit from having more buttons, but I found some games here that play fine with only 3 buttons. First up, we've got Glider 4. Glider really is a great game to play with a controller. This could have easily been a console game back in the day. In my opinion, this game is easier when you use a controller. The only controls that you need are forward and backwards, 1 button for using the battery, which makes you go fast, and 1 for shooting rubber bands. By default, the start button is set to start a new game, A and B are for your power-ups, and C is for pausing the game. I love this game, and even after today I feel like it's even better with a controller. Zoop! If you've ever played this game, chances are that it was on a console, so it probably shouldn't surprise you that it plays like an absolute dream with a Genesis controller on Mac. Actually, it even had a Genesis release, but the computer version has way better graphics. This game is simple and addicting. You gotta match the color of your character with the color of the bad guy to clear them. If you hit a bad guy with a different color than what you have, you swap colors. Like I said, it's a very simple and addicting game. Finally, I wanted to try out a platformer, but I was wondering how a really old one would handle. So I tried out some Space Station FIDA. I did a video about this one a while ago, so if you want to know more about it, check out that video.
Bonus awarded.
And it turns out that Space Station FIDA plays great with a controller. When I first started the game up and tried to play, it was way too fast and clunky. So I had to adjust the speed of the game in the options, but after that, it really handles well and I found it to be more enjoyable with the controller. Next, let's try out an Atari Joystick. I don't have the original Atari 2600 joystick anymore, but I do have many third-party Atari joysticks. It's kind of a challenge to play with these, because there aren't a lot of games that'll work with just a single button like the Atari controllers have. I probably wouldn't play with one of these joysticks outside of testing it for this video, but here's what I tried. Macman Classic Pro. Macman is a classic Pac-Man clone that works on most all classic Macs. I used my Wiko controller to play this one, and what I found was that it was pretty clunky and hard to move around. It does give it more of that classic arcade feel, and I mean it works, but it's just harder to play than if you were just using the keyboard. Maybe if you had a better, more responsive joystick it would play better, but I didn't like it. Next, I tried a little bit of Ingemar's skiing game. Again, here I'm using the Wiko Atari 2600 controller, and this one actually performed a lot better. The preset mouse speed was a little slow for me, so I needed to boost it up a little bit in the ChoiceStick control panel. But after that, I kind of enjoyed this game a little more than I normally do. Shatterball was the last Atari Joystick compatible game I tried. This time I used the much better Epix 500 XJ controller, which is pretty cool in itself that I'm able to use one of these sticks on a Mac. I like the Epix 500 XJ because it has micro switches in it, and it has a real clicky feeling. So did it work? Yeah. Did it work well? No. The default mouse speed was pretty slow, so I had to keep the paddle really close to the ball, which made it hard to grab the bonuses when they appeared. I bet if you went through the settings and changed the speed, maybe set up the friction and such, it'd be a much better experience. However, it's just kinda silly to play it like this. Probably just use the mouse. Alright, my last idea for a controller here is the big one. I was brainstorming and remembered seeing that the company 8BitDo had a Sega Genesis to Bluetooth adapter. And since the ChoiceStick is compatible with Genesis, I thought it would be interesting to see if we could get a PS4 controller working with it. So I plugged it all in, synced the PS4 controller to the dongle, and yep, it worked. So here we are, playing retro Macintosh games with a freaking DualShock 4 over Bluetooth. It's pretty crazy. Man, this is actually the best way to play these games, because on this controller you have a stick and the D-pad and a ton of buttons. Both the D-pad and the left stick function as the same buttons, so you can use either and switch between them easily. The only downside is that you can't use the right stick, and you can only map the buttons to what would normally be on a 6-button Genesis controller. I think all the buttons are there? It's really hard to tell, because there's no way to really check if there's input per button without setting up a custom layout and testing each one. Probably would be worth it if you're going to use this regularly. So first, I tried out the classic Bomberman meets Doom game, Boom, and holy crap, it was like I was playing a console game. The standard Sega 6-button layout works perfectly, and the game feels solid on a controller. Actually, it feels even better than it does when playing with a keyboard. This game is amazing. I've actually never got very far in this game because of the fact that I was playing it on a keyboard. I'm gonna have to dig into this one further in the future. Maybe we'll see it on the channel. So it's time for some first-person shooter action. So I threw on some Marathon to see how this one works on a controller. It works alright. It might just be me, but I'm really not accustomed to using one single joystick to play a first-person shooter anymore. It was clunky and kinda hard to aim, but I mean it worked. It was like I was steering a boat. I believe it was triangle to look up and circle to look down. So I mean at least you could look around. Kinda bad. We used to play first-person shooters with one stick back in the day, so you could probably get used to it. I wasn't really digging it though. Prince of Persia had a great Mac release. Excellent graphics and gameplay, though it was always a little weird playing it with the keyboard. Back in the day I had this game for Mac and for NES, and I remember it being playable with a controller. Like you could actually control the guy somewhat well. So I wanted to give this Mac version a try using the controller. And yep, again this is another great game that's completely playable with a controller. It's only really got a couple of buttons, the D-pad to move and jump around, and a single button to control all of the finer movements. like step forward, hold onto a ledge, drink a potion. This game controls great, and I just gotta say, I love you, ChoiceStick.
Entering Cybernet.
So overall, I found this adapter to be amazing for Mac games. I really like this thing. I do find it kind of weird that I had never heard of the ChoiceStick before. I don't think they did a lot of marketing. Maybe it wasn't a huge success. It had to be somewhat successful though, as they released other versions that had more ports for different controllers. I believe it was the Mark V that had ports for Genesis, Super Nintendo, Nintendo 64, and even PC game port controllers. That's awesome. The Mark V is exceedingly rare. I've never seen it go up for sale. But if I ever find one, you bet we'll check that out. But for now, I thank you so much for joining me and checking out the original ChoiceStick. This thing is a lot of fun to use, and if you're into vintage Mac games, this thing is awesome and definitely worth picking up if you can find it. Hey guys, hope everyone's well. If you're new to this channel, I talk about a lot of different obscure retro gaming stuff that I find interesting or funny. A lot of it you won't see anywhere else. You find another channel talking about the ChoiceStick? Let me know. My upload schedule is really sporadic right now, so subscribe and turn on those notifications so you won't miss future episodes. Thanks, man. Alright, well, I'll see you guys soon. Goodbye.